Over the past decade or so, gaming has exploded in terms of the sheer amount of titles released, and so many more continue to come out on the regular, such that it's become impossible to keep up with all of them. Despite that, there are a select few which will gain widespread recognition, sometimes to the degree that they will become legend even despite their eventual fall. Hawken was one of those games. Hawken was a fast-paced, mech combat-style first-person shooter, with customizable weapons, items, and passive abilities. The mechs were generally tied to a certain style, such as Assassin, Suppression, Support, etc. You had to work with your team to destroy the opposing team's mechs. After all, strength in numbers. It lasted on PC for a good while, up until the servers for said platform closed down in early 2018 after the game had stagnated and slowly died out. From what I'm given to understand, it still lives on in consoles. But since I lack either an Xbox One or PlayStation 4, I can't speak to the state of the game myself. In its active years, it was probably one of the most fun round-based mech shooters I'd ever played. So, the Hawken basically died, and in the time between then and now, small pockets of the internet held rumors about revival efforts, Awakening, Hawken 2, and then, just a few days prior to the time I'm writing this script, Hawken Reborn was released into Steam Early Access. Yeah, that's pretty damn brutal. 75 to 80% negative ratings. Whew. That's something else. You don't see that every day. Then again, if you exist on Steam, maybe you do. Anyway, me being me, I had to see what kicked the hornet's nest. Now, since this is my first public game review project, let me get one thing clear. I judge games based on their standalone merits first and foremost. The reason for this is simple. It's pretty easy to let feelings about prior entries in a series or even a genre get in the way of honest feedback. By putting the majority of my focus on the product itself, I'm able to form much less biased opinions and put forward a review that is fair and honest, unclouded by memories of the past or hopes for the future. So with all that said, cloaks on, hoods up, weapons ready. This is First Contact, Hawken Reborn. As of right now, Hawken Reborn is in Early Access Phase 1. This is about the foundation of the game, and as such, the game is currently in a content-light state. What's established here is the first-time user experience in the form of a tutorial that is spread across a few of the 6 scripted missions, including the narrative, characters, and systems that will be expanded upon in the future. Also of note is the core gameplay and core combat, both of which I consider to be the highlights of the Hawken Reborn experience, at least as it currently stands. Within the cockpit of your mech, you have quite a lot of power at your fingertips, and the surrounding systems that give your actions value beyond obliterating your foes have a good foundation, even in the game's early stages. Built on tried-and-true mechanics from Hawken 1.0 and systems established in the wider gaming space, like Destiny, Hawken Reborn's early access gameplay shows some serious potential, and it's not too hard to see why, even if the overall content level is currently rather light. As I said before, Hawken Reborn's core gameplay and combat are the highlights of the game's current state. There's more to be added, but the foundations are there and they play beautifully. The mechs of the Hawken universe are highly agile, using thrusters to dash in all directions and fly, making combat take the form of a dance that incorporates aspects of positioning, speed, and unpredictability in a way that is uniquely Hawken. The game seems to be designed around getting you to use your jets more than you use your legs. Combine this with dual-wielded mech-sized SMGs, assault rifles, shotguns, grenade launchers, and more, you'll be running rings around your enemies while reducing them to scrap in no time. Of course, you don't have to be fast. Some players might not want to be on full throttle all the time, and Hawken Reborn allows players to take fights at their own pace, adapting both to how they want to play and how a situation is unfolding. Fighting a bunch of infantry? While I don't know who'd want to fight a mech on foot, I do know that these guys are such small targets that dashing around might make them harder to hit. They themselves don't hit crazy hard, usually, so you can afford to set them up and knock them down. While this has the effect of increasing the flexibility afforded to players, it also slightly lessens the importance of having such high mobility. You could, if you really wanted to, play it like a cover shooter. It's not a major flaw, but it is worth noting. Of course, there's also the factor of taking hits, something that will happen inevitably, no matter how much you're firing your thrusters. Hawken Reborn's combat flow doesn't get bogged down with forcing players to take cover for long periods of time. At most, you'll need to avoid damage for only a few seconds, the method of which is up to you. Get evasive, take cover, or just kill them before they can do any permanent damage to your mech. Also of note is how smooth and well put together all these things are. At the time of writing this review, I've clocked 20 hours in Hawken Reborn, and I was constantly on the lookout for hitches or bugs in the game's core combat and movement, and I'm happy to say that I found next to nothing of note. That said, there is one minor quirk. One of my community members discovered that due to the game running on server instances, latency could cause some players to have more issues than others. While the moment-to-moment gameplay is solid, there are still some things that leave something to be desired. For starters, there's a bit of an intrusiveness problem. This is most notably with the game's tutorial. It does kind of drag on a bit, and it does that mobile game trope of roping players into doing very specific stuff. In my opinion, a better approach would have been to explain what things are and what they do, but let the players explore it for themselves. It's already a fairly intuitive design as is. Then there's the game's progression, which is built around raising your threat level, or TL, with upgraded mechs and their equipment. As you move through scripted missions in patrol mode, killing enemies and smashing resource deposits, you'll gather materials that you need to build these upgrades. While getting enough materials for some of the basics isn't too hard, anything beyond that suffers from resource bottlenecks, notably in regards to how many you need as opposed to how many tend to drop. In fewer words, it gets tedious, and the time I spent playing, I wasn't able to upgrade anything to Mark II other than my base mech, the Apex. As such, I can't really comment on how impactful these upgrades are, with the exception of some modifications have really strong effects and others seeming to be more negligible. Proper testing would need to be done to determine the real impact there. On a personal level, I think the resource drop rates and costs could be rebalanced. Some of these are way too expensive, and others, notably modifications, feel like they're dirt cheap. At least getting the blueprints for most of these things wasn't too bad. I think I was only missing a few of them by the time I hit 15 hours. On the upside here, inventory management is minimal to non-existent, as the materials you collect in the field are auto-sorted, while mechs and gear get put in their own spaces within the hangar. This means you won't have to spend several minutes looking for a specific material when building or upgrade, as the materials are automatically selected. Equipping thrusters and weapons is easy as selecting a slot and selecting what should be mounted there. As it stands currently, the upgrade crafting system definitely needs a lot of work. However, it does have the foundations for a great system if proper attention is given to it. With the moment-to-moment gameplay and broader systems covered, we now find ourselves asking the question, so what do we use all this on? That's right, it's time to talk content. Sadly, this might be the weakest part of the game as of Early Access Phase 1. There really isn't a whole lot to it. Beyond the main story missions, 6 at the time of writing this review, there's only Patrol Mode, a zone-based free roam instance where you fight enemies, loot resources, and complete side quests that spawn at random. Without getting into spoiler territory, the main story itself consists of 6 scripted missions based on custom-designed areas of the map that are inaccessible later. The areas themselves work well enough for the fights they contain, although the soft kill boxes can be a little restrictive. The natural curiosity that players have tends to end up curbed by this, so hopefully those get loosened up in the following updates. The difficulty curve of the levels themselves is pretty straightforward, with the first 2 levels being quite easy with fodder enemies. The 3rd level starts to ramp up the danger that they pose, as by now the moment-to-moment flow should be starting to settle in, and by the 4th mission, the training wheels are off and it's up to you to carry the missions from here on out. The final 2 missions will give you an AI ally and a mech to assist, but don't expect them to do much. At most they are a convenient distraction, and it's still up to you to fight hard to get through it. Patrol Mode, on the other foot, sets you out on your own in an open world sort of area. Enemies spawn periodically, and you're free to run around, loot and shoot as you please, and take on randomly selected side jobs. From both what I've read on the Hawken Reborn dev blog, as well as been told by one of the community leads, there are 30 of these such side quests. While I've only seen 17 of them, I can say they're passable, with the tasks being set before you ranging from defending objectives from set waves of enemies, escorting suspiciously talking boxes, or rooting out bandit gangs that are giving the locals trouble. Similarly to the main story missions, Patrol Mode will start out quite easy. Foes, even mechs, will die fast, and don't hit very hard, but don't let that fool you. The longer you're out there, the higher the enemies will scale in terms of threat. They'll get tougher, they'll hit harder, and it puts the question in your mind, how far can I take this? Higher risk, greater reward. That's the main concept at play here. And while it's neat, there's only one patrol area currently, which poses a risk of things getting repetitive. Overall, I found the total amount of content to be on the light side, though not so light as if there's nothing to do. The random quests combined with quickly scaling enemies and highly enjoyable combat ensures it doesn't get stale too fast. Your mileage may vary though. I'm notoriously hard to bore. Gods only know how many reasons might be factoring into that. It's probably the back code. Yeah, definitely the back code. I've had much to say on the gameplay side of things with this one, and as far as Hawken Reborn's presentation is concerned, I think it stands about in the same spot. While there are parts of this that are done rather well, there are others that feel a little lacking and could use some work. All of which would, in this mech's opinion, improve the player experience overall. Let's start with the heads-up display and UI design. By now you'll probably have noticed that while out on mission or patrol, the HUD takes on a simple, techie lines approach with informative elements, overlaid on a mech cockpit that has a number of decorative buttons, knobs, and switches that moves as you do. When you walk around, it bobs, it jerks and drags as you dash and spin around, all to help sell the idea that you're piloting the machine, although it does tend toward a slightly claustrophobic feeling as well. It's fitting, if potentially annoying. One thing about the pilot HUD is that some of the elements are clear and easy to read in the heat of combat, but others, the ammo counts in particular, are cluttered against the cockpit layer, which isn't helped by the small text, combined with light transparency. It can be difficult to get an idea of how much ammo you have at a glance, especially during a fight. The Hangar UI sticks to the same visual style, carrying with it the same pros and cons of the heads-up display. There's a lot of important information here, but the text and background both sharing transparent attributes makes it more difficult to read in places while being clear in others. It's on the cluttered side of things too, and as more stuff gets added, there may not be enough space for the UI to clearly show in its current state, coupled with the potential risk for much more scrolling, which would certainly frustrate players. Looking past the HUD stuff, we find ourselves in the space of visual action feedback and clarity. This is a mixed bag in both plots. On the one hand, the effects of you moving around are pretty solid. Your mech will topple trees, knock over lampposts, and kick chunks out of the earth. Weapons have good particles and animations too. Damage feedback, however, is quite lacking. Enemies don't really react to being hit. Your primary method for knowing when you hit your target is a damage number which will fly off of them, and that isn't a particularly satisfying result. It's not all damage numbers though. Some other sources of visual feedback include a bright blue-white flare that occurs when a mech shield is popped, indicating you are now doing permanent damage to them. Enough damage dealt to a mech will cause it to start smoking, and eventually it'll even be on fire. When a mech or drone dies, it also goes up in quite a lot of flames, smoke, and sparks. On the subject of visual clarity, pickups are easily spotted as colored balls and beams of light shooting off of them, while attacks are all clearly contrasted against the world. Rockets, bullets, and beams are all unmistakable, which is good visual tells for what's shooting at you and from where. Mechs are fairly easy to spot, with each variant having its own unique silhouette, which makes it possible to tell if you're facing lights, mediums, or heavies, and from a reasonable distance at that. On the other hand, there are some enemies that easily blend into the world. This happens a lot with turrets and infantry. Now, loadouts and abilities are a little harder to discern just by looking at a unit's silhouette. All of them have names over their health bars though, which shows this faction and what type it is, and each type has what appears to be a set loadout. For example, Rocketeer mechs will spam rockets, sharpshooters have rifles, and beamers have laser weapons. This applies for all enemies in the game, so after just a few encounters, recognizing who does what is as easy as getting a look at what their type is. Now, if only their name over their health bar was a little more visible. Probably my favorite detail out of all of this is how your mech reacts to what's going on. I spend most of my game time in the Apex, and in the cockpit you can see wires along the top of it that react to positional change. I specify this because it doesn't appear to happen from simply looking around. It'd be nice to see that added in. Also, when you start taking hull damage, the inside of your cockpit shows as much, starting with small holes that escalates up to smoke and even fire when you're heavily damaged. While some of the more important combat details definitely need some work, the world details seem to be in a pretty good spot as is. There's plenty of variance in the terrain and structures that help sell the world as being a difficult place to live in. Housing spaces look to be made of makeshift hodgepodges of sheet metal and whatever technological implements the residents could find and use. And populated areas are full of junk piles and other large discarded scraps that look like they're just waiting for someone to come along and salvage them. Some areas of the game feature more plant-filled scenery, with rocky walls and the occasional structure placed down that serves to show that there are still people around. The environment also has passable responses to being struck by weapon fire. Bullets that hit walls, for example, will create sparks and glowing spots, while beam weapons will scorch objects red hot. There's one other thing I want to mention, since I know its presence is divisive and it should at least be made known. As of currently, there is AI-generated imagery in the Hawken Reborn cutscenes. This puts me in a weird position, because I'm very much on the fence when it comes to the debate, so I'll leave you with the dev's statement on the matter. Quote, "Last week, we briefly addressed AI's influence in our in-game cutscenes, and unfortunately, it only served to fan the flames of distrust since there were obvious signs that AI was used in the final images. We were looking at the conversation from a who made the artwork perspective, which was produced by multiple artists on our team instead of focusing on what the final image looked like. For that, we take the blame and want to confirm that yes, this cutscene will be updated in the future." For better or for worse, Hawken Reborn's audio matches up with the rest of its aspects. There's a moderate mix of good and not so good, but it does lean toward the better side of things. Examples of the good are in the game's primary sound effects. Gunfire from all of the weapons have distinct, clear sound profiles that can be determined well before you see the source. The SMG is given personality by having a low, bassy sort of rumble, where individual shots can be heard, but its overall sound is telling you not to worry about one bullet, but the hail of others right behind it. On a personal note, I used to dislike the SMG's sound, but it's growing on me. The game's assault rifle has a much punchier sound behind it, one I took a liking to almost instantly. And then there's the beam weapon. This one has a seething, hissing sound, with a high voltage sizzling as the icing on top of an already mean sound. It's also probably the most likely to induce an "oh hell no" sort of reaction when you're on the receiving end. While combat is usually a chaotic mess of gunfire, explosions, jets, and thudding footsteps, the sound design of every weapon is enough that you can figure out what's going on most of the time. That said, some of the enemy death explosions don't seem to play quite right. I'm not 100% sure if this is a sound bug or simply lower volume, though if it is the latter, I'd say it needs to come up a few notches.
There should be a console
Or several. Visuals without sound can be very bizarre, and in the case of the drones and mechs exploding the way they do, only for the sound to get muffled, it just doesn't sit quite right. Other sounds that are done well are the steps of the three weights that the mech have. Light mechs have a more tiptoeish sound to their steps, mediums have an appropriate level of thud, and heavies? Those guys full on stomp. On the slightly less great side of things, the voice-acted pieces are pretty hit and miss. Sometimes the NPC chatter is pretty natural.
A beacon. Check its log. We need to find the exact source of the signal.
Good to see you, mate. I hug you, but I seem to be covered in frost. Care to swat a few off of me?
While other times it comes off as forced and even contrary to the tone the situation warrants.
Why are sentient turrets now shooting at us? That wasn't rhetorical.
Okay, yeah.
Prosk have ambushed Haven. They must be after the information too. Please, hurry.
I would have expected that reaction to be a little bit more urgent. There are other minor nitpicks I have, like how toppling a tree by slamming a few tons of metal into it sounds like a tuft of leaves got set aside instead. It'd be nice if the tree snapped and cracked a bit more, you know? The soundtrack, though, that has a Hawken sort of sound to it. It's one of the few times in this main review where I'll bring up what Hawken 1.0 did. It's not quite as in-your-face about it, but it does have that darker, dystopian kind of vibe, and if you stop and listen, you can certainly hear the roots in the sound waves. I mentioned it earlier, but I really want to hammer this point home. For all the mixed bagginess that Hawken Reborn has, I'm quite happy to say that the game itself has been quite stable. With the AAA game industry putting out paid-for products that are not only content incomplete, but also lousy with bugs and crash happier than a destruction derby, having a free-to-play early access product that's as stable as this is quite the breath of fresh air. There's a few other minor things to mention. As I stated in the gameplay part of the review, the game itself is running on server instances right now. This means that it is both an always online game and you can't pause it. It also means that if you have poor connection to the server, you'll probably experience some lag that can mess with movement and combat. The game's setting menu also consists of some pretty basic graphics and control settings, but things like control rebinding and FOV adjustment aren't in yet. Now, with all of the main game stuff out of the way, let's address the elephants in the hangar. First off, Hawken was a PvP game, right? So why by eminence axe did 505 Games decide to go with PvE? Well, simply put, they're looking to be able to reach a wider audience while still providing the same style of gameplay that Hawken is known for. While yes, Hawken was known for PvP, that also served as a barrier for entry for newer players. By creating a PvE game in the same universe, it allows people to start exploring the Hawken universe without being reliant on having other players for a good experience. The devs, in their own words, quote, believe this will aid in making the game more accessible to all types of gamers who can potentially enjoy this world at their own pace, end quote. And I am inclined to agree with this. Player versus player-centric games can be really hard to get into, especially when faced with more experienced players who can make the first few hours of a game quite frustrating, and potentially make it hard to stick around. In this mech's opinion, a well-rounded experience is the best way to go. PvE for people who want to explore the universe, learn the lore, and get used to the style of the game, and PvP for the more competitive types. MechWarrior does this well with MechWarrior 5 and then MechWarrior Online. For Hawken, like I said, both types can exist, and the game would be leagues better for it. Which poses the question, will we get Hawken PvP back? I don't know. From the way it sounds, the devs want to get the PvE experience off the ground first, and that's something I can respect. They've set their goals, and as it stands, are sticking to them. There's one other thing I want to address before we wrap up. The other elephant in the hangar, if you will. Hawken Reborn entered early access with microtransactions. You might have noticed hints of it over the course of this video. This is probably going to be an unpopular opinion, but I personally don't think they're that bad. The game itself doesn't have PvP in it right now, or even PvE co-op, which makes the microtransaction implements on the level of grind skips. And yeah, the game's grind level does need some work, but I wouldn't call it predatory just yet, much less pay to win. A lot of it comes down to a player's own judgment of what constitutes an unfair amount of time investment to acquire certain things. Mine tends to be on the longer end, but yours may be different. I also have my reservations about what constitutes pay to win, but I'll discuss that in another video. Hawken Reborn, as of writing this, isn't a bad game. Don't get me wrong, it's not a great game either. It's pretty mid, in my opinion. A proof of concept, and from where I'm standing, one that is absolutely dripping with potential. I'll definitely be keeping my tabs on this one, and I might even re-review it once it's had some updates. If the game as it is now created this enormous project, then I can only imagine what it'll be like later down the line. Here's hoping I'm right. With this project done and dusted over nearly a month, curse life for getting in the way of things, preparations can begin for my next review and other minor projects. If you like the way I think about games and want to see more, I stream 2 to 3 times a week over on Twitch. Thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and until the next time, remember, keep your core strong and your eyes bright. Gaze out.